It's been 1 week since the election, and the Trump team is moving quickly to form a new administration. The president-elect spent the day with the head of his transition team, Vice President-elect Mike Pence, over at Trump Tower. They're narrowing down the list of potential candidates for the cabinet and for senior White House positions. Reince Priebus and Stephen Bannon have been named for posts. Could one of these three be next?
First of all, I won't be Attorney General.
You won't be Attorney General.
So good. I won't have to decide that one, thank God.
The choice for Secretary of State in the Trump administration is down to Rudolph Giuliani and John Bolton.
John would be a very good choice.
Is there anybody better?
Maybe me, I don't know.
I want to be the general planner looking out over the next 8 years and trying to design how we fundamentally reshape the federal government. And that's a very broad job.
This might be the time that Laura Ingraham, don't say anything, is named press secretary to the future president.
It's wonderful to be considered. I've known Donald for a long time. And, you know, I know most of the guys who are going to be in the White House with him.
Well, you want to know, right? You know who might know? Campaign Carl, because he always has the inside scoop, and he joins us now in studio today, and we're going to keep him here till we get all the answers. Carl, welcome. You're captive of the five now. So we want to know everything. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. You saw Laura Ingraham was on this morning. Kellyanne Conway has been making the rounds. Rudy Giuliani. What's going to happen? Give us your facts and your predictions.
At the end of the 70 days or whatever there are left of this, there will be a foundation for a government. But with the 3,700 to 4,500 jobs that have to be filled, there are going to probably be hundreds that won't be filled. It's quite common, in fact, for a year or two to pass before all of the federal posts get filled, and sometimes they don't. It's been described as a knife fight. A little while ago, somebody called it a Game of Thrones. This is like people who've never been in a transition before.
Yeah.
You might think about a show that the president-elect once hosted called The Apprentice, where he encouraged people to fight, where he encouraged them to compete for their jobs. And there's an awful lot of people who want a very few number of top White House and administrative cabinet level positions, and so they're jockeying. But to use all this sort of hyperbole about it, this is a transition. They are struggling to put together a government. They've got a limited amount of time, a limited amount of people, and an unlimited amount of Americans wondering what's going to come next.
I think the knife fight illusion really stems from the fact that Chris Christie was pushed out and Pence put in place. And that's part of the delay, because Christie had agreements with various departments of the government to share information. Right. He's gone, so that agreement is now void. But I think it's so interesting that, for instance, Mike Rogers, former head of intelligence in the House, a Republican, good Republican from Michigan, he is no longer part of the deal because he was a Christie guy. So that's why people say knife fight.
There was a little bit more to it than that. A lot of conservatives thought that when Rogers was in charge of the Benghazi investigation, he wasn't as aggressive as he might have been. Trey Gowdy, for instance, who was his successor, has been very critical of him. And so, yes, there is that component of it. The aspect of Chris Christie having signed the agreement for the transition campaign to share information back and forth with the Obama administration, Christie's signature was on it. Christie's no longer on the transition, so they need to put the new guy's signature on it. And Pence will tomorrow go to Washington. He'll meet with congressional leaders. He'll sign the document, and that part of the exchange of information will go forward.
Why do you really think, though? What's the backstory with Christie? Is it because the president-elect thought that he was perhaps abandoned by him in the past? Because I heard some of that.
Well, there was a number of reasons. For one thing, the Bridgegate issue is troubling to some of the folks in Trump Tower, not all of them, but that's an obstacle. There was some concern that the transition committee had become way too isolated from the rest of the campaign when the campaign was underway. And 2.5 weeks before the election, Christie was ordered by Donald Trump to take his 150-member staff of the transition plan and cut it in half and send about 75 of the people back out onto the campaign trail, because what good is a transition if you lose? And ultimately, he did. He won.
It seems like you mentioned The Apprentice, though, and it seems like Trump is a pretty good hire and firer. Like, we're saying this kiddingly and making fun of him, but if you look at the campaign, Lewandowski, when he needed somebody who was really scrappy, you know, went to Manafort when he had to do had to do the RNC. And then at the end switched to Kellyanne, who was fantastic. It's not surprising that he then puts Pence in right on the day when he needs somebody who's very serious, who's going to do all the work. I mean, isn't there a positive thing to read into this as well?
Oh, sure. No, what Donald Trump, the president-elect, is trying to do is to get his government, the best possible government, completed in 70 days. Nobody in their right mind would like to try to put together the U.S. government in 70 days, but that's our system.
I think the press just likes to say knife fight because it's trying to make the Trump team seem like a bunch of barbarians.
Sure.
And a bunch of immature rubes that are, you know, slitting each other's throats.
But some of that's actually coming from the people who are going in and out of Trump Tower.
Oh, you're not just
meetings.
like handing off a resume?
No, it's like they're oh my God, it's a knife fight. I was just in there and so and so is going after so and so, or they're competing for these things. And interesting choice of words, but it's not actually what this is a transition. Knife fights, people get hurt. This one, you may not get a job, but you're not going to get stuck in the neck with a blade.
Carl, let's get down to the most important question here, okay? Stop beating around the bush. There's a person here, not at the table, Eric Bolton. Did you see him at the Trump Tower, and what is he up for? Be honest.
Is he being vetted right now?
Didn't see him, but wouldn't be surprised. There's lots of doors, and they do sneak in around us. We're stuck across the street.
Money's are.
To be in the law, but that's
Follow the money's
I just want to say, you know, I want to put the rumors to rest. I will not be the press secretary for the Trump administration. I cannot take the pay cut. And I'm going to be sitting around here. But, you know, I've heard two names about that. I've heard Kellyanne Conway, which she's very deft, and she can pivot, and she's graceful and beautiful, and that's one approach. But then Laura Ingraham, I mean, she would just be out there laying siege to the media on a daily basis. It would be like must-see TV. And that's just probably maybe the continuing strategy of Trump's war against the media. That could continue to mobilize his base and keep the media on defense.
Well, but if Trump were to pick somebody who would be well acquainted with those of us in the fourth estate, that's going to blow up in his face.
Yeah.
As soon as whoever it is behind the podium in the Trump White House starts agreeing with the tone of the questions of the press, that person needs to be pushed out, and somebody who can pick a fight will come in.
Right.
Who are you closer to?
There's a whole bunch of names out there. One of the things they are not talking about very aggressively is who will be the political director, who will be the comms director, who will be the White House spokesman, who will be the White House press secretary. There's a lot of candidates, but
any names that stand out?
They've got Donald Trump to do the talking.
What about the choice between, you got Rudy Giuliani and you got John Bolton. It's like a choice between a Porsche and another Porsche, an embarrassment of riches. Can you have both? Can you have both of them in the same administration?
Well, John Bolton's already been the UN ambassador.
Yeah.
He hasn't been a National Security Counsel to the President of the United States, and there are other positions in national security that he could get involved in pretty easily. Rudy Giuliani clearly has the short track on this. For him to be joking about maybe I'm better than Bolton, having complimented him, is pretty much him telling us that Donald has given him a wink.
Right.
So let me just ask you about two people who, as we saw when Kimberly was doing the lead into our segment, seem to have removed themselves. One, Newt Gingrich, who says he'd rather be the big picture guy, but I thought he was up for a major position. And the second one is Ben Carson, the neurosurgeon, and again, I thought he was up for...
You have news on that?
Excuse me?
You have news on that?
Oh, well, my son, Rafi Williams, broke that story for Circa today. But I thought Carson was positioned to either do HHS and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act or B, education. But he, too, has pulled himself out.
Right. Well, there's differing versions of who pushed and who pulled. One of the versions is that Ben Carson, a brilliant neurosurgeon who spent his life dealing with human tissue and cells, would have a real difficult time dealing with the biggest bureaucracy in the U.S. government, which is in itself the biggest bureaucracy, and never mind that it would be with the repeal or the reform or the revision or the whatever it's going to be to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Ben Carson is a great, great mind. Being an intellect isn't necessarily what you want at Health and Human Services. You want somebody who can wield a sledgehammer. He's more of a scalpel kind of guy.
Well, there were a few times in his past where he was pretty good with a sledgehammer. It wasn't a knife. I can't remember.
I don't remember.
A hammer? I can't remember.
That's when Trump said he was pathological.
Yes. Those were the days.
Oh, you have to bring up these things. You liberals.
Yesterday.
Let's ask about Rudy and Secretary of State. So he doesn't strike me as someone who's terribly diplomatic. I mean, is that the idea, that he has sort of a gruff way about him, or is it the idea of him going in and reforming the State Department? I mean, that could be one angle on it as well.
I think it's all of the above, but it's also that his international company, after having been the mayor, has taken him all over the world. He's met with world leaders as part of his security company. He's been deeply involved in anti-terrorism work, both in the public and private sector, not just as the mayor of New York, but again, after that. He ran for president in 2008, but that's not the only thing he's been doing. So he does know a lot of these foreign leaders by name, and he certainly understands the terrorism threat. He certainly understands radical Islamic terrorism.
Yeah.
And reform of the State Department is something that every secretary does. It's going to be reformed from Hillary Clinton and the Democrats just by virtue of the Republicans.
He's not going to use a private server if he's Secretary of State. He's going to stick with .gov, right?
One hopes. One hopes.
Okay.
Listen, but he actually knows the law and will follow it. I think he's a fantastic choice. I think you need serious reform in the State Department. This is right now in the world and the climate that we're dealing with, geopolitical climate, one of the most important positions and selections that President-elect Trump can make.
You know what it is that all these names have in common, whether Newt's involved or not, or Rudy Giuliani or Bolton, they're all adults. It seems like, this cabinet has a different theme.
There's no Van Jones in this.
Yeah, the sensibility of the Obama administration in the beginning was somewhat childlike. The idea that we can change the world if we just feel good about it. We can do it. We don't need adults like people that go, well, wait a second, there's terrorism out there that we have to deal with. So
Killjoys.
Yes.
But one of the criticisms immediately of the Obama administration was having promised hope and change. They began to put people like Tim Geithner at Treasury, and they were formers of previous administrations and things like that. So we should be watching very carefully as to whether or not that ends up being the practice of the Trump administration.
What about Rick Grinnell for a UN ambassador?
Well, that would be
smart.
history-making, and it sends a message that the Trump campaign and the Trump family very much want to have heard that they will be friendly to the LGBT community.
I'm passing it along, and there he is.
The Muslim countries will be really thrilled over that.
Yeah, one last thing to you, Carl, on the
and he's very pro-gun, Second Amendment.
A lot of criticism of Bannon and Breitbart. Just quickly, what's your take?
I've known Steve for a long, long time. In fact, when he was working with Andrew Breitbart back in the early days, he's a very, very bright guy.
Yep.
He does his homework. He communicates it personally, quietly. He doesn't need to be out front. He understands that the
brilliant tactician.
Having your hands on the levers of power requires you to keep your mouth shut sometimes. Some of what he's been criticized for is the Breitbart webpage isn't necessarily where he comes from.
Well, it's grossly unfair.
But he needs to at some point to address the criticism and point that out. That I was running an operation and some people wrote some things that I may not necessarily agree with, but Breitbart News was controversial, is still controversial. He's now out of it. He's not controversial as the senior counsel to the president at this point. We've not heard from him.
Can I offer some perspective on this? Because as someone who wrote out at Breitbart, Lena Dunham is deeply offended by this choice. And I believe that anything that deeply offends Lena Dunham has to be the right choice.
Isn't she in Canada by now?
No. She changed, but she left a voicemail with Paul Ryan, basically saying how upset she was. And it must be like getting an oral wedgie.
Ew.
I can't imagine that kind of voicemail.
That is just
exactly. I wanted that response,
good.
Kimberly.
Thank you.